Sinking Stories, the imagination of Lowlands in the Anthropocene. Hello everyone, I'm Katie Ritson and I'm recording this talk at the Rachel Carson Centre in Munich. The pandemic has made it impossible for me to travel to the Netherlands in person, and I'm a long way from the coast now. From here to the lowland coasts of the North Sea is more than 700 kilometres as the crow flies. But in some senses it doesn't really matter, because it's the imagination of the lowlands that I'm interested in. And so I'm going to try and imagine that I'm standing out on the dike now, looking out to sea. Imagination is a tool that scholars of both literature and history have in common. It's what allows us to read between the lines of our sources. It's the alchemy that exists in the space between the texts we read and the world as it is experienced by people. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the imagination of the lowlands as it manifests in literary texts, and show how this landscape, which, as you know, being Dutch historians, is as much a human construction as it is a natural phenomenon, has been made and remade over time. In doing this, I'm making an argument for the significance of these imagined wetlands for making the climate crisis tangible and exploring the role that humans have played in shaping the natural world. Before we start out for the dikes and polders of the North Sea lowlands, I want to take you on a detour. In this strange virtual world, everything is now possible, and so we can travel together to the Sundarbans in the Bay of Bengal. You might want to consider a change of clothes at this point, because it's really pretty warm in the Sundarbans. Equatorial heat, mangrove forests, lots of oozing mud. And by the way, watch out for the tigers. Our guide for this part of the trip is the scholar and writer Amitav Ghosh. I think many of you will have encountered Ghosh's 2016 book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change in the Unthinkable, in which he writes about the mechanisms by which we, in his view, have managed to conceal from ourselves the consequences of our technological and colonising agencies. Ghosh credits literary fiction with an important role in influencing the way that nature is perceived in the Western world. By the way, the cover of this edition of the book shows an aerial view of the Sundarbans. While the Sundarbans are a long way from the North Sea, there are some similarities with the lowlands in Europe. Low-lying and flood-prone, the culture of the Sundarbans, like the North Sea lowlands, is imbued with the memory of both sudden and dramatic floods and slower processes of siltation and movement. Ghosh recognises in the Sundarbans not just this legacy of adaptation to both sudden and incremental processes of change, but also the possibility of the Sundarbans for imagining and understanding the Anthropocene, past and future. Ghosh's sensitivity to the Sundarbans first comes to bear in his novel The Hungry Tide from 2004, which is set there and features floods and landscape instability. Subsequently, in The Great Derangement, Ghosh reflects on his personal interest in flood-prone places. He sees this as stemming partly from his own family history of migration from the banks of the Padma River, now Bangladesh, when a sudden flood drowned their village. Even though Ghosh has these family stories that testify to the precariousness of human settlements and the overwhelming power of the floodwater, he writes of the difficulty he has found in writing about environmental change, as he puts it, and I quote, "translating these perceptions into the medium of my imaginative life, into fiction, that is." Ghosh is a novelist who writes in English, and his novels have been enormously successful globally. But what he identifies here is a disconnect between the sense of place he knows from his personal history of disaster migration and his awareness of the 21st century climate crisis, and the imaginative form of the novel. Ghosh explains this disconnect in The Great Derangement by saying that literary fiction, he also calls it serious fiction, or sometimes the realist novel, that this works to reenact the same kind of dominion over nature that Enlightenment Europeans were busy enacting at home and abroad. If we are to follow Ghosh, then realist novels are devices by which we have been misled into an extractive and colonialist modernity with no room for nature. Novels have employed modes of concealment, those are Ghosh's terms, to hide the unpredictability and inhospitality of the natural world. Damming and draining wetlands, extracting resources, maximising productivity were hallmarks of 18th and 19th century activity. Indeed, some scholars see this long moment of early industrialisation as the event that ushered in the Anthropocene. Ghosh argues that as humans work to conceal and subdue non-human agencies and unpredictabilities, fictional texts were consciously or unconsciously doing the same thing, creating narrative spaces where there was simply no room for the agencies and temporal scales of the non-human world, that is, no room for catastrophic floods. Literary texts were also building figurative dams and reclaiming land, and in doing so, both reflecting the New World Order and, at least in the cultural imagination, constructing it. So let us return now to the Netherlands and the equally muddy lowlands along the North Sea. These European lowlands, like the Sundarbans, have a long history of coping with flooding from storm surges, rivers, and a rising water table. Petra van Dam, among others, has described what she calls the amphibious culture in the Netherlands, comprising a whole range of cultural adaptations to regular flooding. Floods were a fact of life, and human coping strategies were focused on minimising damage. In Petra van Dam's view, this amphibious culture ended in the later part of the 19th century, when new materials and engineering technologies allowed for urban settlements in low-lying areas, and an increasing independence from the environmental constraints that had limited development until then. The end of amphibious culture coincides broadly with the rise of the realist novel in Northern Europe, and so the modes of concealment employed by water engineers to protect Dutch society against floodwaters, the concrete, the improved dikes, the warning systems, are echoed by narrative devices that keep the floodwaters safely away from the action. It seems that Dutch writers were just as effective as Dutch engineers in creating a largely urban country in which much of nature is largely absent or out of sight. Dutch literary scholar Isabel Hoving cites the author Maarten het Hart as saying that Dutch literature is a literature of city dwellers. Isabel Hoving goes on to analyse the peculiarities of Dutch literature as displaying a remarkable paradox in that, and I quote her, "A country that prides itself of having created itself through inventive, exhausting feats of engineering appears to be hardly interested in its own natural landscape as the historical witness of centuries of interaction between men and nature." Where the specific watery landscapes and processes of the Dutch lowlands do make their way into literary form, it's in the context of the country's pre-modern history. And by the way, this is where you're going to have to use your imagination to correct my pronunciation of Dutch titles. Arthur van Schendel's 1933 historical novel De Waterman addresses the Dutch battle with floodwaters in a period of religious and national upheaval in the early 19th century. Van Schendel presents the catastrophic floods and the failure of the dikes as obstacles to Dutch enlightenment and improvement. The protagonist, Maarten, is a social outcast for refusing to accept the dominion of both the Calvinist God and the power of the water. Maarten is told by his father, "In our country, the Lord punishes more severely with water than with fire." The Netherlands of the early 19th century is depicted as being literally stuck in the mud, held back by fear and ignorance from renegotiating its dependence on the environment and on the Almighty. The floods in this novel are instrumentalised as foundational obstacles on the Dutch path towards nationhood. They are to be overcome. In this way, we can read the novel as being in line with Ghosh's arguments. The floods are within the control of the narrative. Maarten, the tragic visionary hero, dies before his ideas of freedom from flooding and from divine surveillance can be realised. And that's the tragedy, that society, then, is not in a position to act upon his insights. The novel was published in 1933, and so it has relevance for the political situation of the 1930s. The flooding is seen in its historical context in the novel as born out of a failure to act, to come together as an enlightened society and solve the problem. Implied by this story of the tragically misunderstood hero are the preoccupations of the Netherlands in interwar Europe, when the continent was in nervous recovery from the muddy horrors of trench warfare. The Netherlands, too, was mired in disputes about the political way forward and also about the state of its water infrastructure. The work done both physically by engineers and culturally by novelists in removing watery nature from view, or aligning it with a kind of pre-modern stagnation and oppression, as we just saw, also goes some way to explain literary responses to the 1953 flood. This, the Netherlands' worst flooding disaster of the 20th century, that claimed some 2,000 human victims and huge loss of livestock and damage to property, made very little impression on Dutch literature in the decades after it happened. This is exactly the kind of completely unforeseen disaster that Ghosh talks about in The Great Derangement. It seems incompatible with the world of tame nature and carefully curated risks in modernity. Realist novels are supposed to write about reality, not once-in-a-century flooding events. Ghosh writes, "Here, then, is the irony of the realist novel. The very gestures with which it conjures up reality are actually a concealment of the real. The 1953 flood was painfully real to those who lived through it and died in it, but the kind of reality that sees storm surges bursting in on people asleep in their beds did not find its way into literary novels. At least, not until now." The past 2 decades, roughly speaking, have seen a whole range of novels, not just set in the Lowlands, but actively engaging with these landscapes and their histories. I should underline at this point that I'm not a scholar of Dutch literature, I'm a comparativist. In my work, I'm interested in the differences and connections between the various literatures of the North Sea lowlands. So my research looks not just at the Netherlands, but to the north, east and west, to literature written about the low-lying coasts of Denmark, Germany and England as well. I'm currently working closely together with the Dutch literary historian Eveline de Smalem on a project to look at literature and conservation practice along the length of the Wadden Sea, and our research confirms many overlapping themes and tendencies. That's Eveline on the right, and it's me on the left. There are Dutch novels, including the 1999 novel by Margriet de Moor, De Verdronkene, that is set during and after the 1953 disaster, and novels for teenagers such as Overstroomd by Eva Moraal, that look into a dystopian future society in which humans are divided into those who live in dry areas and those who live in flooded ones. But this is, I argue, part of a much wider development of interest in the lowlands. Recent novels by German authors Uwe Timm and Jan Christoffersen, by British authors Meg Rossoff and James Runcie, and Scandinavian authors Kjersti Wiik and Amalie Smith all point to a renewed interest in the lowlands and the history of flooding there. Some engage with the longue durée history of repeated floods, siltation and human adaptation. Others with the singularity of violent storm surges that swept away whole tracts of land. But all show a particular awareness of the fragility of lowland areas and the unpredictable and frightening power of the water. This takes us back to Amitav Ghosh and his argument in The Great Derangement about the realist novel as being incapable of imbricating non-human agencies and scales. Ghosh's arguments in The Great Derangement also find a response in his own subsequent novel, Gun Island, published only 3 years later in 2019. Key places in this novel are the wetlands of the Sundarbans and the low-lying urban spaces of Venice Lagoon, where, it seems, the complex causes and effects of the Anthropocene are most liable to become visible. The migration of humans and animals, floods, increasing pressure on land and resources, and a growing recognition of the interconnectedness of things. My fellow literary scholar Ursula Kluvik calls Gun Island an example of an Anthropocene water fiction. She notes, and I quote her, that Venice is also a sinking city, another one of the places most vulnerable to climate change. There are concrete connections between Venice and the Sundarbans, not only in post-colonial and economic, but also in environmental terms. Ghosh is trying in Gun Island to break out of the restrictions of the serious novel that he identified in his previous work. He makes an effort to reinsert non-human agencies into the narrative. The novel abounds with lively and improbable animal meetings, movements of people and ideas across oceans and between continents, and natural forces like storms, wildfires and floods that are menacing and capricious. Ghosh also makes use of local stories and myths, which characters in his tale recount to each other as a way of drawing on a longer and pre-modern history of human-nature relations. And it's here that I make the connection between Ghosh's lowlands and those on the North Sea. In The Great Derangement, Ghosh warns us, and I quote, that those on the margins are now the first to experience the future that awaits all of us. Ghosh uses these margins in his fiction as places where the realist novel can incorporate the new and the old realities of animate and threatening environmental forces. This aligns with my own findings from the sudden emergence of a number of novels written about the North Sea lowlands. The porous, muddy and unstable edges of the northern lowlands, when they appear in fiction, allow for the multiple scales of climate crisis to be visible. One of the main ways that novels do this is by drawing on a sense of the landscape's history. I could give you many examples of this, but unfortunately I only have time for one. This one's not a work of Dutch literature, but it's a piece of fiction that's concerned with the Netherlands. It's a short story by the US writer Jim Shepard called The Netherlands Lives with Water. In this story, which was first published in 2010 and is set a few years into the future, Shepard gives us a somewhat ironic commentary on the pragmatic approach to water management that carries on even as the threat of catastrophic flooding looms larger and larger. The narrator is a rather gloomy dike engineer in Rotterdam. In a sense, he's the literary descendant of Martin Rossaert in De Waterman. He's in charge of monitoring smart dikes and warning systems, even though he knows that they will be insufficient to hold back the water. The story all takes place within a couple of years, and it's centred on its human characters, but even so, it's able to draw on a landscape that has a much longer history. In one place, the narrator obsessively recounts the history of flooding in the Dutch lowlands. Bishop Prudentius of Troyes wrote in his annals that in the 9th century the whole of the country was devoured by the sea. All the settlements disappeared and the water was higher than the dunes. In the St. Felix flood, North Beveland was completely swept away. In the All Saints flood, the entire coast was inundated between Flanders and Germany. In 1717, a dike collapse killed 14,000 on Christmas night. In another part of the text, the narrator muses on the fact that 5,000 years ago it was possible to walk from where I live to England. At that point, the Thames was a tributary of the Rhine. He moves us further back into the history of the landscape. And he also notes that crushed shell deposits can be found, and I'm quoting again, 7 metres higher on the dune lines inland than anyone believed floods had ever reached, deposits that look to be only about 10,000 years old. What this drives home is a sense of a landscape that has a long history of repeated flooding, a landscape in which humans do not have the central agency, but are incidental to cycles of ice ages and global warming, floods and retreats. As the tension builds towards the floodwaters at the end of the story, we know already that these will breach the smart dikes and inundate the overflows, that the cycle will continue, even as our attention stays with the narrator and his predicament. The agency of the water in the text is inscrutable, impersonal, and cannot be subject to any kind of instrumentalization by the humans who have to live with it. I think what we can learn from this is that the dikes built to keep out the menacing power of the water, whether physical entities on land or figurative dikes in the lowlands of the literary imagination, are not, nor have they ever been, impermeable. As awareness of our environmental crisis seeps back into the stories we tell ourselves, it seems that lowland places have a particularly rich history to draw on. The imagination of lowlands past and future has global significance for the understanding of the environmental crisis we all face. Amitav Ghosh has shown this with his fiction set in the mud of the Sundarbans and the sinking city of Venice. The novels of the North Sea lowlands, meanwhile, are displaying collectively the same sensibility to the long history of environmental change and human adaptation. I hope that this talk has captured your imagination, at least for a short while. I'm looking forward to meeting you and talking to you in the discussion. Thank you.